Hey, world history folks. Today's screencast is going to be mainly for the virtual students, and it's going to be on the second phase to China's Communist Revolution or Civil War. And this is going to focus on some later factors that happened in the late 1930s and into the 1940s. That is the Japanese invasion, which is, as I mentioned in small group yesterday, that's an additional source of bloodshed in addition to the Chinese Civil War. What is called the Second United Front, where Mao and Chiang actually team up against the Japanese, and the communists rise to power, the fact that Mao ultimately prevails in this civil war. So these are going to be the key touchstones in this part of the Chinese Civil War / revolution. So let's get after it. World War II in China is one of the most noticed aspects of World War II, at least here in the West, here in the United States. There's a lot spoken about in terms of the fight against Nazi Germany and the island wars against Imperial Japan in the Pacific. But what Japan does in China is every bit as traumatic and brutal as the most brutal things that happen in all of World War II. The Japanese invade mainland China in 1937. As of 1936, Chiang still refuses to fight the Japanese before the communists. Chiang is very much committed to eradicating Mao and the communists. I mean, this is after the Long March. This is after the communists had had several brushes with near total defeat. And it's only the invasion of mainland China that finally convinces Chiang to focus on the broader threat of the Japanese invasion. I'd like you to watch this clip. It's about 7-8 minutes long, and consider the question, how did the Japanese invasion affect China? List the several ways. And we're going to move on there. To show you how Chiang saw events occurring in the late 1930s, there's this quote of his, and I'd like you to think about it. "The Japanese are a disease of the skin. It can be cured. The communists are a disease of the soul. It affects the whole body." And that's kind of how Chiang saw the situation. He wasn't a fan, obviously, of the Japanese invading and occupying chunks of China. He was still a Chinese nationalist, and he fought against that. But he saw communism as a deeper systemic threat that could undermine the viability of China. And he saw them both as threats to his power and things that needed to be resisted. The Japanese, for their part, are, as I use the word brutal, you could think of lots of other descriptor words, do tremendous damage and commit numerous atrocities in their occupation of China. They engage in what is called the 3 alls policy: kill all, burn all, destroy all. And this is very effective. Something like 10 million Chinese civilians and military deaths are encountered during the Japanese occupation, and there's reasons to believe that maybe even that is an underestimation. There's something called the Rape of Nanking, which is the Japanese occupation and destruction of the Chinese city of Nanking, which is an infamous event in Chinese history. It's one of the most traumatic acts in really the entire history of human warfare. Its legacy is still a strongly felt thing in China today, and it's a source of tension between the Chinese and the Japanese today. The level of brutality and atrocity that was committed in the Japanese occupation of Nanking. And to underscore that, we want to show you this clip here. The task that we want you to do is to find one word to describe this survivor's recollection of the experience at Nanjing. This is another spelling of it. Nanking is the old spelling, Nanjing is the newer spelling. Why did you choose it? Explain in your notes. So the effect of World War II in China, what ultimately happens? Well, in 1938, Chiang moves the government to a city called Chongqing, which is much more inland, away from Japan and away from the occupying troops closer to the coast. After Pearl Harbor in 1941, the Japanese assault on the U.S. naval base in Hawaii, the U.S. decides to fully back Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, the KMT. So Chiang gets kind of an infusion of support from the Americans, that Chiang becomes the clear U.S.-supported military guy in China. From 1942 to 1945, the war years, Chiang often will attack the communists as much as the Japanese, even though they're on paper supposed to be fighting the Japanese together. In 1945, World War II ends, of course, and this is not a presentation on the intricacies of all of World War II, but the Chinese Civil War resumes, and it goes into its final phase from 1946 to 1949, where Mao is back fighting against Chiang, even though they temporarily teamed up in the war against the Japanese. Remember, I mentioned in small group this week, the Chinese Civil War lasts over 20 years. It's only interrupted by the Japanese, and that shows you the extent of the difficulty and trauma visited upon the Chinese people. I'd like for you to read this quote from a book on Mao Zedong. And the question I'd like you to consider, how did World War II seem to affect the Chinese Communist forces? What did it mean for Mao and the Communists? Try to answer that question as you read this. Ultimately, to kind of gloss over that final phase of the Civil War, in October of 1945, the Chinese Communists, or the CCP, win out in that long 20-plus year civil war against Chiang. Mao proclaims the People's Republic of China. He and his communist forces prevail against all odds. This is not something you would have expected back in the 1920s. In 1949, having lost much of China to Mao and the communists, Chiang flees to the island of Taiwan, or at the time it was called Formosa. The U.S. supports Chiang and refuses to recognize the new China led by Mao and the communists, which gets renamed the People's Republic of China. This is the official name that still exists today. The Republic of China emerges in Taiwan. That's what they call themselves. They take on the name of we're the official China, the real China, because the old China is temporarily run by the communists and Mao. They'll keep this title into the 1970s. Taiwan will call themselves the Republic of China. So we're going to do a lot more on Mao's impact and vision for China, but I wanted to get you thinking about his general vision for what to do in China. Mao starts with a campaign called Walking on Two Legs, which is basically a campaign for gender equality amongst men and women. That is going to undermine a lot of the traditional domestic values in China. Mao wants to focus on agriculture and using as much of the Chinese population as he can to boost Chinese agriculture. When he takes over in 1949, 80% of the population is working as farmers. It's a very small percent, only 1/5 of the population is going to be urban workers and living in cities. Mao also sets out on a very ambitious program called the Five Guarantees to guarantee food, housing, clothing, education, and medical care to all Chinese. And the expectation or the transaction here was that if you followed the rules, the government would provide. There's a term that comes out of this called the iron rice ball. Essentially, if you work hard and you follow Mao's vision, all will be cared for. This was kind of the over-encompassing vision and promise of the communists, is that the wealth of China, the productive capacity of China would be shared with the people. And that's what we're going to leave it off here. Mao prevails in this civil war against all odds. Chiang flees to Taiwan, and the U.S. refuses to recognize communist China. And that's where we're at by the late 1940s, early 1950s. So with that, this screencast is over. Make sure you complete the tasks and take the weekly quiz.